minutes, would that be good?
Yeah, more than enough. I'd much rather have this as a conversation. So, I mean, as you just mentioned, we're all very proud Indians, proud of our ancient civilization and so on. But the key thing to remember about that ancient civilization is that it was driven a lot by the oceans and our relationship with it. In fact, you mentioned that our maritime history goes a lot further back from the Cholas to the Mauryas and so on. But in fact, it goes back a lot longer to the Harappans. So we have at least 5,000-6,000 year history of great oceanic voyages and much older than the Phoenicians, who are in the West considered to be the pioneers in this space. So first of all, it's not for nothing that there's only one ocean in the world that's named after a country, and it's the Indian Ocean. So that is one important thing. But the second important thing, which relates to risk-taking, is that this expanse of ocean was explored at a very early stage by Indians, and this required extraordinary risk-taking. So we were sailing these ships. There is a good reason why there's a whole country named after India called Indonesia, or there is Singapore, Singapura, and so on. And you find Korean history beginning with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. All of this was done by ocean. But this attitude of risk-taking, unfortunately, at some point in our history we lost. Indeed, after the Cholas, we began to fear the seas and imposed on ourselves the idea that crossing the seas was somehow not a good thing to do. And it didn't protect us at all. What happened instead is that those very oceans ferried across people from very far away who came, and ultimately in different waves. People forget the Portuguese, then the French, and of course ultimately the British. They came and colonized us. They colonized us from the oceans, which was once, in fact, our strength. So the first thing to do is to actually reignite in our own imagination an idea of the oceans as something that we explore and we're not afraid of, and have a risk-taking, exploring, adventurous idea and worldview. And so one of the projects that I have engaged personally on this is to build a ship from the Gupta period, a 1600-year-old designed ship called, now that ship is in the water. It's now part of the Navy fleet, as many of you will know. It's called INSV Kaundinya. We are currently attempting to learn how to sail it. Do remember, there's no living person who knows how to sail these ships. But hopefully end of December, we will sail it to Oman. So it will include 15 expert Navy sailors and one random economist who will attempt to make this crossing. And if that is successful, following year this time, we will attempt to sail it from Kalinga to Bali. So 2 voyages planned for it, and after which the ship will be put on display in the Lothal Maritime Museum. So one is to simply tell the story. You will also be interested in finding out that I am actually right now rewriting all the social science textbooks of NCERT, which includes both the economics and the history parts. And believe you me, it will have a lot of military history and specifically naval history and oceanic and maritime history included in it for the very first time. So those of you who have studied history growing up in India, none of you will probably have read about, other than maybe one line on the Chola raids on Southeast Asia, nothing on our maritime history. Well, the new generation of history books will be full of it.
Bravo.
And it's not just about the voyage. You see, there's an entire ecosystem that backs this up. People forget that our economic system was based on corporatized guilds. And these corporatized guilds were basically producing almost on an industrial scale products like metallurgical products, cloth, and so on. Spices were in fact not so much an Indian product, except black pepper. Most of the spices were actually imported by Indians from Indonesia and then sold on to the Europeans and Arabs. So anyway, these huge corporatized guilds which had their own navies. So when the Cholas raided Southeast Asia, They didn't rely on the Royal Navy. They were doing it on the basis of the navies of the corporatized guilds, which already had navies. And who was financing these great voyages? It was the temples. That's why there was so much gold in the temples. You see, the temples functioned as banks and venture capital funds that were funding. So all of this history has to be retaught to young Indians so that they know this. Now, in this context, let me bring you more to the present. This ancient India was successful because it was able to do these risky things. Crossing the oceans on a small stitch ship is a risky thing, especially when you have no idea where on earth you will land up on the other side. And that spirit has to be there in our innovation and indigenization program that we are trying to do today. As the previous speaker had just mentioned, the very nature of risk-taking is that most of it will fail. And you should, roughly speaking, have an 80-20 rule. Only 20% of the innovations made will succeed. Now, if we have a very sarkari attitude towards how innovation is made, we're never going to innovate. That is not innovation at all. If you have a hit rate of 80% in your innovation, that just means that you did not stretch the system enough. So when anybody comes and says, oh, I have an 80% hit rate, it just means you did not try hard enough. You weren't innovating enough. So we need to, first of all, create a culture. And this has to be a national culture. It cannot be siloed into a box in, innovations by DRDO or something like that, or IDEX. This has to be a national culture. Everybody should innovate. And military technologies are just a part. It's a reflection of that. I keep telling people that economics, politics, and military power are downstream of culture. If the culture is one that encourages innovation, then you will innovate in every aspect. You will innovate pretty much at the same time you're innovating in culture and economics, you will be innovating in military power. There's no example of a country that became a great military power but did not become a cultural power, and vice versa. It has to be remembered that a library that does not have an army is almost certainly going to be ultimately burnt down. Our own history, the history of Nalanda, tells you that. So we need to innovate as a nation and a wider culture. And occasionally things will go wrong, as indeed happened very recently with our aircraft. They just crashed in Dubai, sadly. Tragic accident. But the fact of the matter is, you go back and look at the history of innovations. Europe, the rise of Europe started with Spain and Portugal. And you go back and look at the history of their explorations. A lot of it was horrific. I mean, the ships that the Portuguese were losing while trying to go around Africa and repeatedly, seeing entire ships and their crews disappear in tragedies is incredible. And yet they persisted, which is why a tiny kingdom on the edge of the other side of the world ended up dominating the Indian Ocean. And of course, it then was taken over by the British, who are also not a particularly large country, because they were continuously willing to take those kinds of risks. Now, if we have pretensions of being a great power, and we should have one, then we should also have an attitude where we should plug forward irrespective of the losses we take along the way. Because some part of innovation and indigenization means that we will make mistakes and we will stretch as we stretch the technology. And so, sad as this recent incident may have been, let me be clear, we should not be put off by it.
No.
And we should continue. But it also means, indigenization also means that we do not get stuck in the ambassador car syndrome. Indigenization does not mean shoddy products. Yeah. Occasionally, we may have to be okay with 80% of the product, but let's be all very clear, it's only the first generation. By the third generation, it should be 100% of the product. So all of this requires a certain mindset, and ultimately, before I pass it on, let me just reiterate, it comes from a national culture, and that national culture has to be built from childhood.